For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. I am your host Jade Black and today I'm talking about communication. This episode is somewhat inspired by some Twitter discourse that went around a little while ago about nodding and shaking heads, and it got me thinking about how communication works in the world I write in, and there are some differences with our world that you wouldn't necessarily expect, especially given the sort of cultures and our view of certain cultures and people. So, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about really is long distance communication, because this is something that comes up a lot in my writing because of people in politics and international communications and all of that. Now, there isn't electricity yet, that's just not a thing so far. So really the way you do this is letters and messengers. That is the deal. Messengers are just not common though, because the neutral zone is so vast, and as time goes on it gets more and more dangerous, and unless something is really, really urgent, that just doesn't really happen, especially given that there is a priority postal service, and they are very, very quick. So if you really want to communicate things quickly, the priority postal service 99 times out of 100 will do it just fine. So messengers are somewhat redundant because of that. I mean, you get them in like times of war, but really that's kind of about it. So generally speaking, everything is done via letters. And with letters, you can tell very quickly where things are from, because there's a postmark for each nation, and this is their national flower, and national flowers also have a colour to them. So in Hukai it is the white camellia in particular. So all types of camellias are associated with Hukai, but the white camellia in particular is the national flower, and the ink used for the postmark will be that ink, unless it's the priority postmark, which is always using blue ink. Now, Lierre's national flower happens to be the blue tulip, and Heraith is the bluebell, so it can be a little hard to tell the difference, but with those sorts of inks, they generally fall quite close to purple, whereas the priority postmark blue is very, very clearly blue. So there is a difference, unless you're a bit colourblind. So have fun, if you are. But the postmarks don't quite stop there. This is most of what you see in World, but prisons also have a postmark, and the prison postmark does vary a little bit by nation as to exactly what the symbol is, but it's always in a bright orange ink, so you generally have a pretty good idea. And militaries have a postmark as well. In Hukai, this is the shuriken mark. That can be really any ink colour, that doesn't matter quite so much, but generally speaking, that's black, which it's not used for any other postmark. There might be other postmarks for different military divisions. This is a nation by nation thing, so Hukai does have this for spies. Spies have their own slight variation on the military postmark, but I don't believe Malasal has this. And yes, postmarks do get faked as well, because, I mean, it's done via, the old-fashioned stamper. These can be nicked or forged or just ordered. So a lot of people do have, say in Hyukai, a lot of people, if they send mail a lot, they will have a stamper in their home. You know, you can order that. And if you then, say, left Hyukai to go and live in Malasol or something, I don't know, anywhere else, well, you can just take that stamper with you, and for all anybody knows, if you still use that stamper, it could still be from Hyukai. Nobody has a way of knowing otherwise, unless somebody knows where you live or saw you. Like, they're just going to assume it's from Hyukai, and this does happen on page, that this is faked. Now, not everybody does have a stamper in their home. This isn't particularly common, and if you go to the post office to send like a parcel or something, because like you need to do that unless it's like a thing that can fit in, you know, letterbox. If you need to send a parcel of any size, you're going to be going to a post office directly, and in post offices they do have stampers that people just use. The only thing that you will find with this is priority ink isn't something that just anybody can have. You won't find this in the post office. This is a thing really for diplomats and maybe some senior military only, maybe some nobility depending on what nation you're in. This is not something the everyday citizen has access to. And you might think, well, what if an everyday citizen needs to send something priority? Well, you're probably just going to be told no, to be honest. It's very... that whole postal system is a very niche usage. So, and the normal post system is pretty good, so that's unlikely to happen. If you really did need that, though, you'd have to approach a politician and hope they listen to you. So, good luck with that. So I wanted to talk about directness of communication as well, because this is something you see quite a lot with a lot more neurodivergent writers talking about how frustrating this can be, and people having more neurodivergent prominent main characters, prominent side characters. This is a conversation that seems to be happening a bit more on the socials as of late. I might just be more aware of it, I don't know, but I wanted to touch on this anyway. And there are a few things that are common across the whole of the land. So, generally speaking, if someone invites you to something, they do mean it. It's pretty rare for someone to, you know, do the polite invitation that, you know, they don't actually mean, oh, you must come to dinner, but like, don't. That's not really much of a thing. If someone says, oh, you should come around for dinner sometime, they mean they actually want to arrange it, and generally, right then, on the spot, like, hey, are you free Friday or whatever? Yeah, okay, let's do that then. That's almost invariably what that actually means. And then there's the phrase, you look tired. I believe I did mention this on a previous one of my episodes, that depending on what side of the pond you are in our world, that can mean quite different things. And that is true in their land as well. Sometimes people do just mean you're getting enough sleep, but a lot of the time this does actually mean, is everything alright? And it's not necessarily a, do you want to talk, it's sort of a, do you want to talk about it or don't you? It's not pressured one way or the other. And generally speaking, communication is pretty similar to what we're familiar with, maybe slightly more direct across many nations. There are a few exceptions. So in the south, Malasol and Saleh primarily, although Amarichi do have this as well. Kui and Zhong sometimes do, but not really. Generally speaking, they're a bit more direct about things, so there's a lot less ambiguity on the average. That doesn't mean there's not ambiguity. There's definitely a thing in certain situations, but it's not anywhere near as common. The Northwest, however, so this is Horizon the Era. They are a lot more weasel wordy with things, a lot more sort of hidden meaning in things, and this is where you get into the So is an invitation actually an invitation? We're not sure. There's a lot more of that in those two nations in particular. And of course there is a slight status thing that comes into this as well, with how direct you should be, and different sects of professions and all that, different sects of society. So in any kind of politics there's going to be more opaqueness here. And South Fjordvik in particular is quite an interesting one, because if you're the sort of social hierarchy in South Fjordvik is a lot stricter. It's more of a problem if you get it wrong. So with South Fjordvik, if you're on the same sort of pegging as somebody, or somebody's beneath you, it's often very direct, and there's not much ambiguity, and it's quite terse, quite brusque. If someone is above you, oh boy do you lick their boots. Like, you very much watch how direct you are, unless they explicitly say, look, just tell me what you're on about. And if you get that wrong, oh boy, don't. How about? So let's move on to gestures. And this is one that I had to do some thinking about and this is very much what inspired this episode, is the sort of head shaking versus nodding thing, and I am not going to wade in on that debate because personally I think it's dumb, but I did have to do some thinking to think about gestures in my writing, because I don't... It's a subconscious thing. I'm so familiar with it that, oh yeah, they do this or they do that. And it's not quite the same as we do here. So there's a lot more to do with head movements. Like if you're saying to someone like, come this way or follow me, that's much more that's almost invariably a movement of the head. To like tip your head one way or the other to say come this way, or that's very unlikely to be a hand movement. Hand movements actually really aren't used that much, which is almost kind of the inverse of our world, I feel like. Because head movements... I think a notable head movement that comes up a fair bit on page is Haru tipping his head when he thinks. And while that is common in that world, that people do that a bit more on average, Haru does tip his head a little bit more than average, and I think with hand movements, there's not really much of that at all. You do get the odd thing with, the more crass gestures, perhaps is a way of putting it, like, that is all hand movement, because it's supposed to be a very clear statement of intent. That, you flip somebody off, that is an entire thing of its own. The other hand movements just aren't really that much of a thing. There's the odd one or two, but not really. I think the next most logical place to go from that is the sort of formal greetings thing, and how these get standardized over time. So in our world, like, the handshake is the standardized sort of formal greeting. Oh, hi, hello, handshake, continue on the conversation, whatever. Like, that's very normal to us, and that does happen there as well. Like, the handshake is a thing and is common in every nation, but the bow really is about even. Maybe slightly less common, but it's not by any means unusual to see that. Like, nobody's going to blink in surprise or anything if that's the way you go with it. And this isn't just used by the Hukis. Other nations do this. Quien Chong is the very obvious example of another nation that uses the bow a fair bit, but you'll see this in most nations from locals. And a lot of this sort of handshake and bow stuff comes from the days of the Empire. Once upon a time, all of that land was Huki's land. It was the Huki's empire. So they used the bow, that was what they did. and when they had contact with others and other people sort of came by, and a lot of this comes from Kana and Kana's journey to the mainland and then back off because they didn't really like it as much. A lot of that, it wasn't that one way was particularly forced on anybody, it was just that a hybrid of the two became adopted. It was like, oh, so that's what you do, well, this is what we do, well, I mean, we can just, like, do both or either or whatever. It was very much understood that, okay, you do it this way, we do it this way, we can just make that a thing, both, either way. And back then, between international different communities, it was more common for people to do one and then the other as well. And this was very much about, in the order of which it was done, was very much about the sort of hierarchy. So if it was the Hyuki's emperor with somebody from, let's just take the example of Kana, the bow would be done first and then the handshake. Whereas if it was the leader of Kana with just somebody from Hyukai, it would be the other way around. That's not really that much of a thing anymore, that's a very old-fashioned thing, but it's not gone. And another one that I did want to touch on as well, because this comes up more than I originally anticipated on page, is how touch is used in communication. Because in a lot of cultures you don't really, touch people that much. In Britain you don't do that very often outside of specific scenarios, it's not really much of a thing. But that's different over there. So even in somewhere like Hyukai, touching people in certain ways for communication is not unusual. It's not, even if you don't know them per se, you might lay a hand on somebody else's, or hand on arm, or arm round the shoulders, hand on a shoulder, that's pretty normal. That's more normal there than it is in the UK. Interestingly. It's not what I was expecting as a writer. Anyways, in Malasau, this is just completely normal. Like, touch is a much bigger thing there than anywhere else. Like, they will hug strangers without thinking too much about it, and it's not that that doesn't happen in Hyukai, but I mean, in certain scenarios it can happen, but it's definitely not common, whereas in Malasau it's not that big a deal. And a particular one I wanted to touch on was elite soldiers, because, Shadow on the Snow, Shinichi is an elite soldier, and it does also come up on page in Miss Nakagami as well, that elite soldiers have a set, in Hyukai at least, of hand signals that they use for each other, and this is about what fingers they sort of link together, whether that's little fingers or a little finger and a ring finger, and all of that has a lot of meaning. And this is, again, something that just you wouldn't really pick up on or have a clue what it means unless you've been taught. I think last, but certainly not least on this episode, is the coded messages aspect of things. Because this doesn't happen as much as you might think. There are ciphers that do appear on page, but they're really not used that much, because, I mean, they're not that uncommon, code words and, like, the little newspaper puzzles that you get in our world. Again, that's not unheard of there, that certain newspapers have things like that, and cartoons, and you can get little puzzle books and things. That very much happens there. So ciphers are not generally used that much. Instead, what people do is they just change language a lot of the time. And there are a lot of languages on that nation that people can choose from. I mean, it's not just the sort of assigning code words to things or replacing phrases. That does happen, and that's very common in everyday conversation. If you just want to talk about something in public that is not necessarily appropriate for that. People do that a lot. But people do just straight up change language, and this comes up on page a lot because a lot of my characters are multilingual, working in international relations and all that, that people will just completely switch language to avoid people knowing what they're talking about. So different people have different go-to languages for that, and this has been really interesting to write about. In that I and Haru seem to slip into American for that in particular. That seems to be where they go, whereas Hanzo and Jiro go into Canaan. And this is the thing that people will do. The Southfjordovans, even, as isolated as a nation that they might be, they will also do this. Across much of the continent, people will speak, whatever the local language is, and Lieran. Lieran is somewhat of a universal language, in the sense that, back in Imperial times, it somewhat became that way. Both Liera and Malasau both have, the root in that language, and Horaith does as well. They all originally spoke that language, so it became a bit of a default just off that. But, people don't generally... A lot of people don't speak more than one language. A lot of people don't, if they don't go into certain fields. But if they do, they pick up Lieran. But people don't speak more than that, so if you go into another different language, and Canaan is a good one to go into because a lot of people don't really speak that. Very few people speak that. But it's not fail-safe. You've got Haru, who speaks all of the languages that are still alive in any sense. Haru is interested in languages, he's very good at them. He thought it would be useful and also kind of fun. So this just won't get past Haru. You need a cipher for somebody like that, but Haru's a bit good at those. You don't hide things from him, is kind of the deal. So yeah, there are a lot of different ways that people do communicate, be this written down, be this verbal, long distance, non-verbal. There's a lot to this. And it's been really fun to learn about and play with a bit, and learn that even in certain nations, like Hyukai, you can be more direct than you might think, and more direct than average for Hyukai, but no one's really going to be that bothered about it, whereas in the era people very much will. And the cultural differences with stuff like that, and gestures, and particularly formal greetings, and how there's so much history in that, and how things become standardized. And this is true in our world too, that a lot of things have become standardized. If you think about, numbers, the symbols that we use for numbers that are understood across the whole world. There's a lot of stuff like that in this world too, and it's really interesting to find where those roots are and how that evolves over time. What things are seen as old-fashioned, such as doing a handshake and a bow, that's an old-fashioned thing now, but back in the day it once wasn't, and how that still continues to progress over time, and how a lot of people pick up gestures when they move nations. So in Malasau, quite a common gesture in communications as reassurance or all sorts is to take someone's hand in both of your hands, and how different characters who have been to Malasau a lot or have lived there for a while pick that up. And in terms of pouring tea as well, this is something I talked about on the tea episode a while ago, in terms of who pours tea and when, and how that's different in each nation. So in Hyukai, you pour the tea of the person who's more senior than you, you pour your boss's tea, whereas in Malasau it's the other way round, so that they show appreciation for you, and in Hyukai it's a respect thing, I respect you, and there are exchanges where people don't do that, or people will sort of argue, no, I should do it, no, you shouldn't. I love all these little details in world building. I like to play with that and find out more about that and how the sort of organic growth of a society dictates what happens, and how the international community plays a big part, and this all plays into global politics as well, and who are the big players on the international stage. Well, that's a certain group of nations, so their stuff becomes more standard and more universally understood than others. And it doesn't mean that other people don't understand, because it's such a melting pot. People do still understand those things, and there's still like reference points and all that, but things get more broadly adopted or they don't, and I like all of that. And if you like all of that as well, and you want to know more about world building and all of that in general, well, this podcast is a great place to start. I mean, the best way to know what's coming up really is to subscribe or to check me out on Instagram, so you can see the advance notice of what the episode for the week is, and soundbite teaser reels and other things when I play with them. That's Jade_Black21 on Instagram. But if you really do like all this world building, and you like to see some art as well, art associated with world building, or just character art as well, there's a place for that now too. That is Pinterest. That's Jade_Black21 on there as well. And if you want to see more and hear more and get live updates on how all of this plays into my writing, that's on Twitter. That's JadeBlack21. And last but certainly not least, if you too are a writer and you are published or well on the way, please do get in touch. I would love to be a part of your journey. You can do that via email. That's jade42black@gmail.com. There is a list of stuff I want to know in the description below. Please read that and include all that information in your initial contact. Automatic no's are something I don't want to give to people, and because it's no good for anybody at the end of the day. A few things to note: if you are indie or self-pub, you are the people I want to hear from the most, by far. There is no genre category requirement, there's no age requirement, it doesn't have to be a novel, doesn't have to be new. Whatever you've got, bring it in, let's see what we can do. And until next time, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like, it helps the channel a lot. Intro and outro music by me, copyright J Black 2024.